Good afternoon and warm welcome to all of you concerned about what pollutes the truth about climate change. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Romero. I'm a senior researcher at DisinfoLab, and I'm part of climate change disinformation, so I'm really happy to moderate today's session. Before we start, just a few housekeeping rules. So we are going to have a Q&A session using Slido. So you can either scan with your phone using the QR code that you see on your screen, or write the code hashtag DisinfoLab at slido.com. This webinar is going to be recorded, and the replay will be available on YouTube, on our YouTube channel afterwards. Just to get started, I will kindly ask you, our dear participants, to complete the first questions you'll see on Slido, which are: where are you joining us from today, and which sector do you represent? Thank you. And in the meanwhile, for those of you who do not know us, just a little information. So the EU DisinfoLab is an independent NGO focused on researching and tackling disinformation campaigns targeting the EU member states and its core values. And we also advocate for improvements in the field. And today we are thrilled to be pairing with the Heinrich Böll Foundation, who has supported this webinar on climate change disinformation. And well, we would like to thank them for that. There will be other things to come. We can't reveal everything right now, but this is a valuable first step for us. Thanks again, Heinrich Böll Foundation, for making this webinar possible. False, wrong, misleading information, whatever we want to call it. But this type of content always distorts perceptions of climate change science and solutions, creates confusions, and often leads to delays in climate change action. In today's webinar, Polluting the Truth About Climate Change, we are going to talk about how conspiracy theories try to convince us that the climate fight aims to reduce our personal freedoms. And we are also going to inquire about how some political leaders use climate change in a populist way and for very specific political purposes. We are honored to have a fantastic lineup of speakers to discuss about this and much more. Let's get to know them. We welcome first Alexandra Geese. She's been a member of the European Parliament since 2019, and she's the digital expert of the Greens EFA parliamentary group. She negotiated the Extensive Digital Service Act, and she was elected vice president of the group in 2022. Her main focus areas are democracy in the digital age, sustainable digitalization, and gender equality. We also have the pleasure to have with us Jennie, Head of Climate Research and Policy at the Institute for Strategic Dialogue. She has spearheaded investigations on climate denialism and the sources of delay, as well as co-authoring ISD's flagship reports such as Deny, Deceive, Delay, among many, many other things. I also warmly welcome Adam Barnett, DeSmog's UK news reporter, where he covers climate misinformation, corporate greenwashing, and climate science denial. I am now delighted to give the floor to Zora, Siebert, Head of EU Democracy and Digital Policy Program at Heinrich Böll Foundation European Union, who will explain why disinformation about climate change is an important issue for them. Zora, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Anna, and also a warm welcome from my side. So maybe briefly, just for those unfamiliar with the Heinrich Böll Foundation, we are a political foundation close to the German Green Party, and our primary mission revolves around political education and advocacy both in Germany and abroad. We strive on stirring meaningful conversation and critical conversations about the nexus of sustainability, democracy, and technology. And over the years, we have focused our efforts on combating various forms of disinformation that pose threats to our society. For example, homegrown disinformation in the EU, gender disinformation, election-targeted disinformation, or disinformation on the COVID-19 pandemic. However, today, we turn our attention to the increasingly pressing concern of climate change disinformation and its implications. And for that, we are very proud to have partnered up with the EU DisinfoLab. And because we are only having 60 minutes, I pass the floor right on to Alexandra Geese, digital expert and esteemed member of the European Parliament for the Greens EFA. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Very happy to be here with you today. I think climate disinformation will or might be the most crucial issue of the upcoming 2024 European election campaign. You know, we have a very important election year in 2024, elections in February in Indonesia, then in June in Europe, and then the US elections, obviously. And I think that election year will be absolutely crucial for saving the climate, for still being able to save the climate, but also for saving our democracy. Why am I saying this? We are seeing for the first time in Europe, Europe-wide, a US or Philippines style of preparing the elections. All these mechanisms were widely documented since 2016, for example, by Peace Prize laureate Maria Ressa, but also from the US. So we see an election campaign where the political debate is not so much based on facts, but on disinformation, on hate, and on basic lies. This is what we are seeing in Europe as well. What we're also seeing in Europe is a clear shift to the right or to the extreme right. So while, for example, if we have a look at the European Council, well, before we had Poland and Hungary, which were sort of considered the exceptions, now we have Italy with a far-right government, Sweden with a moderate conservative government with 20% far-right that is tolerating and very strongly conditioning that government. We do have fears about Spain in July, where far-right party might come into government. We have seen the Slovakian president not running for elections anymore because she is under threat and hate from the far right. So we are clearly seeing that in council. We are also seeing it in parliament, where Manfred Weber, the head of the conservative force EPP, wants to team up with ECR, so the far right, after the elections. And we are seeing that the crucial issue where this policy is put into practice is climate and nature. So right now, for those of you who are following European politics, there's a huge fight about around the nature restoration law, which a progressive side wants, but EPP, so the conservatives and the far right, want to stop, and we don't know how this is going to go. We're going to see this in the next week. This is not a coincidence. The leader of the far right party, ECR, and head of the Italian government, Giorgia Meloni, has come out a few weeks ago and said, well, the fight against measures to stop climate change will be the main agenda. And we know from research that the topics that really work strongly in social networks to get to voters who are more middle ground in politics, who don't have very strong politics, are sort of what is called identity politics. So it's migration because it's us against them. It's gender because it's the so-called normal people against everybody else. And now it's climate. And this is what Giorgia Meloni, as the head of this far-right movement, has said is going to be the topic, and we are already observing it in the European Parliament, and all the Green Deal fights are being stopped now, the natural restoration law. In Germany, we have been experiencing this, and it's very interesting because as long as combating climate change is just a question of numbers, a very abstract question, it doesn't really qualify as an emotional element. But when you come down to actual policy, like, for example, in Germany, we have this law foreseeing that heating systems will slowly be changed. Well, we see this in many big cities where you try to abolish parking lots in order to be able to cycle there or to have tables outside. Then some people feel really threatened because this seems to be part of their identity. And there we see that the other forces work with a lot of lies, with a lot of information, disinformation, and a lot of personal attacks. And this works extremely well on social media, and therefore it gets really a lot of attention, and this jumps into the media. So I think what we need to think about is how to address this, not only in terms of facts, of having the better facts, explaining people climate change better is not going to help. We need to address the emotional needs of people here. And we need to explain to journalists how the system works, how the targeting in the social network works, how algorithmic amplification of climate disinformation works, in order to make sure that at least in normal media, correct information about climate change, combating it, and the policies that we're implementing work, because I think this will be one of the really central issues in the next campaign, and we have to make sure that we get really through to the people, because otherwise we will have a really hard time saving the climate, but also saving democracy. I'm very happy to be able to hand over to one of the major experts that can really bring these two topics together: how digital networks work, how the information ecosystem works, and how climate change and climate disinformation works. That is Jennie King from the ISD. I'm very, very happy to hand over to her today.
Thank you.
And you have the floor, Jennie.
Thank you, Alexandra, and thank you everyone for having me today. I'm going to focus on one particular aspect of climate misinformation today, which is the way that it's been co-opted into a bigger universe of conspiratorial thinking, and the way that a lot of public discussions around key policy issues, whether they're climate or, as Alexandra said, migration, gender identity, racial justice, how all of them have a number of centralizing and unifying themes now that relate to mistrust of institutions, state-citizen relations, and ultimately people's fears coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic that their individual liberties and freedoms are going to be infringed upon by some elite group, whether that's their national government, whether it's multilateral bodies like the UN or the EU, or whether it's an even more abstract group of so-called globalist elites that can include everybody from George Soros and Bill Gates to Greta Thunberg, or I'm sure even some of the people who are on this call would be considered within that group. So the first thing that I wanted to highlight is, why has climate become vulnerable to this kind of weaponization within identity politics and within the culture wars? I think the important thing to say is that climate denial and climate delayism, which I'll explain a little bit more in a second, have existed since the 1970s. So they're not new phenomena. What has changed is the way that climate has become a point of entry for these larger culture war style conversations. So rather than having a conversation about the substance of environmental issues, we are now sat in a very different space where climate is seen as being symbolic or representative of major fractures and fault lines within society. And again, that's where we can draw a lot of parallels with other key polarizing topics, including migration or, sex and reproductive health. And what has happened in the process is that a conversation which in the past was relatively niche and largely being defined by, vested interests and industry actors, has now broadened out and become a lot more decentralized, and a whole new and diverse set of actors are participating in those discussions and becoming key gatekeepers for the public in how they understand and engage with climate change as an issue. And that includes, professional disinformers who have made a business model out of the outrage economy online. It also includes explicit extremist and conspiracy movements who see climate as, just another agenda for implementing authoritarianism, as well as some of those more traditional actors like carbon major companies, oil and gas companies, etc. And so when ISD talks about climate, we now refer to it as being a hybridized threat landscape, which means that it is a public policy area where this enormous array of actors are finding common cause and are coming into collision with each other, both in the online space, but also offline. The other question that I often get asked is, why now? Why do things really seem to be reaching a fever pitch at this particular moment in time? And some, examples that you may have seen just in the last couple of months are the hysteria around 15-minute cities, or, the amount of mis and disinformation that is currently circulating in relation to the Canadian wildfires, and the implication that, they're being started by left-wing arsonists. Why is this happening now? We've known about climate change for 50, 60 years. There have been efforts to delay action on climate change for almost as long as that. So why do things seem to be in such a feverish moment at this particular point in time? And what I would say is that mis and disinformation and broader influence operations thrive in moments of crisis. And that could be economic crisis, it could be social crisis, it could be political crisis. But that creates the most fertile ground for both average people to be exposed to this kind of content, but also for it to penetrate into mainstream discussions and to have resonance beyond these kind of fringe or conspiracist communities. And at the moment, unfortunately, we are dealing with 5, 6, 7 concurrent crises that are all happening in tandem. You know, the first of those, and we really consider it to be a radicalizing or a turbocharging event, was the COVID-19 pandemic. But the aftershocks of that event are still being felt in a number of different ways. We have the cost of living crisis, we have spiraling inflation, we have a generational trend of economic inequality that is occurring across Europe, but also in other contexts around the globe. And then on top of all of that, we have the incredible foreign policy and international diplomatic implications of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and also the consequences that have brought in terms of supply chains, you know, disruptions to energy markets, etc. So all of these things are occurring in parallel and are creating, in essence, the perfect conditions for mis and disinformation to thrive and for them to become the dominant voice within conversations around key issues like climate change. Now, one thing that I want to highlight is, what is the difference between climate disinformation or misinformation versus these other topic areas that we've discussed? Is there anything that makes it distinct and unique? And I think the main point that I would highlight here is that climate change has had a professionalized disinformation industry for decades in a way that you really don't see around some of these other very polarizing culture war issues like migration, like public health. You know, if you look at the COVID-19 pandemic, most of the pushback and opposition and the mobilization that was taking place online was largely organic and decentralized. So it was coming from the grassroots. And yes, some of those actors might have had, you know, vested interests or motivations, but it wasn't necessarily organized at the transnational level. Whereas we know very obviously that there have been industry actors, you know, companies and their PR and lobby groups that have been honing a messaging calendar and a very sophisticated playbook of influencing public opinion for decades. And that there is a lot more money circulating in the space around climate mis and disinformation than you might see in other spheres. At the same time, it is the case that climate is also becoming more organic and decentralized. So the kinds of trends that you saw playing out during the pandemic are now also true for environmental issues and the climate policy conversation writ large. So it has become co-opted into the culture wars. And as that happens, the kind of influences, the kind of voices that can shape public opinion have shifted. So it's no longer the case, it would be entirely misrepresentative to say that every viral video which is spreading climate denial or climate delay has the funding or the backing of an oil and gas company behind it. That is absolutely not the case. There are plenty of people who now see a profit motive and incentive in spreading this kind of content because they know that it gets likes, they know that it gets engagement, and as a result, they can generate advertising revenue, they can sell merchandise, and they can increase their own personal brand by engaging in that conversation. And there are a lot of kind of tactics or rhetorical techniques that you see taking place in the climate space that absolutely match other key issues. So, you know, the scapegoating of individuals, singling out these villains who can become the main targets of attacks and abuse. You also see the importance of catchphrases, and I'm going to talk about a couple of those in my examples. So things like climate lockdown or climate hoax, climate scam. The importance of repetition, just flooding the zone with content that takes up all of the oxygen across social media and creates the impression that that is the consensus position, that the majority of people don't believe in climate change or they don't believe in the solutions that are on the table, when actually that is not an accurate reflection of public opinion or what is represented in polling and other forms of analysis. The other key point, and then I'm going to go into one or two examples, is the shift that we've seen in denialism itself. So the assumption had been made that climate denial, claims like climate change doesn't exist, no longer had the kind of social capital that we saw in the 80s, the 90s, and the early noughties. The public opinion has shifted, and there is general consensus around the problem of climate change and the need to take action on it. But actually, what we're finding, and particularly in the last 12 months, is a really concerning and startling resurgence of denialism, both in traditional and social media, but that is reframed for this particular moment in time. So rather than just saying we don't trust the science, which is kind of potentially the more traditional form of denialism, climate modeling is unreliable, the evidence doesn't exist, it's too early for us to make predictions. Instead, you're pivoting to don't trust the scientists, don't trust the people who are the key communicators and experts and institutions trying to educate you about climate change. And that, as I said at the start, aligns perfectly with this broader trend of mistrust in institutions, the breakdown of public life, and the fact that people no longer have faith in the traditional gatekeepers and institutions that have defined the way that we deal with problems. Governments, media outlets, higher education institutions, all of them have seen a very rapid decline in public trust. And what comes in and fills the void is, self-appointed pundits, people with no scientific expertise, people who have a brand as being contrarians in the online space, or being controversy merchants, and what they are saying is don't believe in climate change, because anyone who is promoting climate action has an agenda that you are unaware of. There is an invisible plot that you can't see, and the ultimate goal here is to change your quality of life, to strip away all of the things that you care about, and to exert control in a way that enables government tyranny and authoritarianism. And the perfect example of that, or one very recent and acute example of that, is climate lockdown. Now, this language first appeared 2 days after news of the Wuhan lockdowns first appeared in the international media. So that is how quickly certain accounts were trying to create an association between the public health crisis and future green tyranny. In the beginning, the accounts that were really trying to land this narrative and make it go viral were affiliated to the fossil fuel industry. They are explicitly associated with a think tank called the Heartland Institute, and they were clearly trying to use the pandemic as a way of inserting their pre-existing worldview, which is climate action is bad, into the mainstream. But it wasn't until about 4 to 6 months into the pandemic when the mainstream media started talking about this language and making comparisons between, the level of urgency and public response that we'd had to COVID with the lack of urgency around environmental issues, that this conspiracy suddenly took off. And the reason why that happened is because these accounts could suddenly put themselves in opposition to the so-called mainstream media. And they could say, see, this is what they want to happen. As soon as COVID-19 and the pandemic is over, they're going to try and reinstitute these kind of policies under the pretext of solving climate change. And once that had begun to gain traction, once it had begun to go viral, suddenly it was picked up by right-wing media ecosystems, not just in the Anglosphere, but in a number of geographic and language contexts. And then it began to penetrate these much more explicit conspiracy and extremist movements online. So, QAnon groups on Telegram, or anti-vax communities on Facebook, communities, many of which had forged during the pandemic out of a genuine sense of public concern and, grievance and trauma, but were suddenly being pivoted into a number of these other policy issues. And you can see here the kind of evolution of that content. This is from the original big piece of research that we published in 2021, which shows here you have this kind of original seed accounts linked to the fossil fuel industry, Finally, they manage to have their breakthrough moment, and they penetrate and gain a platform across the right-wing media ecosystem, including disinformation outlets. And once that happens, you gradually have a normalizing or mainstreaming process until you end up in these far more extremist spaces, including, Aitken, Telegram, Gab, etc. Now, the most recent iteration of this, and this is where I'm going to finish today, is 15-minute cities. So since 2020, climate lockdown has now become just part of the disinformation playbook. It appears near daily. There is a steady drumbeat of content that is referring to this kind of terminology because it has reached enough of a critical mass of exposure that it has kind of resonance within the general public. What happened in December is that language was then used in the context of this policy around 15-minute cities and urban planning, and trying to create communities that were not optimized for vehicles, but were actually optimized for citizens and having public services within walking or cycling distance of people's homes. And once again, the language of climate lockdown resurged, but kind of metastasized or distorted to fit this new moment. And I think what's really important to emphasize and maybe to finish off is that this is not just something that exists in the abstract. I often get asked, does any of this matter? Is this not just the reality of being online in the 21st century? Conversations are toxic. People have crazy views. They get pulled into echo chambers or rabbit holes of content. It doesn't necessarily change things, does it? And what I would say is 15-minute cities is a very good example of the kind of real world harm and how rapidly the situation can escalate. Within the space of just a few weeks, you had protests being mobilized on the streets in the UK, in Canada, in France, in Australia. You had death threats being sent to local officials, council members. You had council meetings being invaded by members of the public who claimed that they were, shills for the New World Order and that the councils were acting on behalf of this globalist cabal. You also had even more dangerous kind of mobilizations to violence with extreme far-right groups, white supremacist groups, and neo-Nazi groups latching on to this idea and saying, see, this is the reason why you shouldn't trust governments, you shouldn't trust elites, and ultimately you should push back against climate action as a whole. So I guess where I would leave us in saying the conversations around specific climate policies, the net zero transition, electric vehicles, they are all extremely important. And there are definitely influence operations that are trying to delay action in that space. But what concerns me even more than that is this backsliding of our potential as societies to have conversations about important issues, because everything is framed in this conspiratorial mindset. And what that means for the possibility of talking about anything, big or small, national or multilateral, when it comes to the issue of climate. And I look forward to answering some questions about this in the chat later. I think I'm passing directly over to Adam now, who's going to talk a little bit about how these kind of ideas and narratives have been explicitly taken up by the political system and what that means at the European level. So over to you, Adam.
Thanks, Jenny. Am I audible to everyone? Yes, excellent. It's always difficult to follow Jenny King with a typically insightful and rich presentation, but I'll do my best to talk a little more about how climate disinformation is used for political ends. I thought I'd start with a quick taster of the sort of thing I'm talking about. So I'm going to try and share my screen with you all. Bear with me. Okay, so I thought it'd be easier to show you what I'm talking about rather than merely describe it. Pardon me. Okay, hell with it. adverts, as always, getting in the way of what you actually want to do and see.
Maybe
What I was going to show you was a clip from a UK TV channel called Talk TV that was set up a year ago. It was owned by News UK, part of the Murdoch media empire. And it's a good example of what I'm going to be talking about today, which is something I've dubbed climate populism. By way of introduction, I should say my name's Adam Barnett. I'm a news reporter, investigative journalist at an outlet called DeSmog, which has been going for about 17 years in North America and the UK as well, but we also cover Europe. Typically, we cover the way fossil fuel companies support think tanks and fake experts and politicians and media outlets and create a network which pumps out climate disinformation, primarily denying the science of climate change, but also attacking any effort to address it in policy terms. What's new, I think, and Jennie set this up brilliantly, is the way this has been swallowed up by a broader political project, which is sometimes called culture war politics. Incidentally, if you want a quick definition of that, I would say culture war is politics by other means. Since the COVID pandemic and paranoia and justified concerns about restrictions to do with COVID, but also I would say increased interest in and responses to the climate crisis from Greta protests and so on. Increasingly, what you've seen is people who are not previously interested very much at all in climate, and I'm talking here about media pundits and political actors, suddenly making it part of their shtick, their rhetoric, and their pitch to a mass public. The way this trick kind of works is to promote a resentment of elites and of liberals, or liberalism, I should say, and any sort of government action to address general problems in society. Typically, they favor nationalist solutions over internationalism. That's why you get a lot of hostility towards, say, the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the International Energy Agency, the European Union, and so on. Any cross-border collaboration for social goods, progressive ends, is met with extreme hostility. They also prefer what they would call free market solutions to any kind of state or government intervention or regulation. And also in terms of values, they would go for status quo conservatism over anything that might be more progressive. In the climate space, what I found in my reporting, and I'm going to give just a couple of big examples so you can have an idea of what to watch out for. These are very prevalent in America and the UK, but also across Europe, I would say, and I'll try and give some examples of those. Effectively, two main areas. One is attacks on climate action, be it policy or activists and advocates for doing something about it. So what you get in the UK, for example, is relentless attacks on the UK's net zero target as a sort of symbol for all society's problems. And again, it's something, it's framed as something that is pushed by elites who don't really understand people's ordinary concerns, and this is a unnecessary and damaging project that should be discontinued. In Europe, you get more, and this comes from the Alternative for Deutschland in Germany or Vox in Spain and so on, hostility to the European Green Deal and policies like that. Also agriculture policies in the States, the Green New Deal, or elements of it that have been incorporated into President Biden's Inflation Reduction Act. So they'll just take that and use it as a sort of catch-all term for climate action or general sort of a non-specified elites telling you what to do, telling you what you can't do, what you can't eat, how you can drive, and so on. With a view to discrediting the need for that and efforts to do it. And I should say also constant attacks on climate protesters and their methods. That's a sort of daily occurrence here and across Europe. The other side, which is, or the other example I'm going to give is support for fossil fuels and the supposed continuous need for them. There's a few elements to this. It's become a lot more acute in the last year, given the global energy crisis that's been sparked by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. You see in several different countries arguments about energy security, access to having our own fuels, be it gas. In the UK, it's a big push last year to overturn the UK's effective ban on fracking for shale gas, or criticism of the phase out of coal in Germany, and so on. There's a version of this in more or less every country, that being reminded in a post-pandemic period, but also by events in Ukraine, not to respond by saying this shows that we should try and wean ourselves off of fossil fuels and move more towards renewable energy, which is reliable and not subject to these volatile global conflicts. But instead that we need to double down on these fossil fuels and make sure that we have them here and we can protect, quote unquote, our people from these sort of global threats and fluctuations. One method by which these messages, these attacks on climate action, I should add also, very common, you'll hear it all the time, people attacking wind power and solar power and renewable alternatives as not really working, not really being reliable, and that's another argument in favor of the continued use of fossil fuels. This is pumped out increasingly, I would say, through right-wing media outlets. In the UK, we've seen 2 TV news channels set up in the last 18 months. And I think this is a model that is going to be or is already replicated across Europe, which is to sort of import a US Fox News style of media populism to stir people up and get them outraged against elite efforts to, as they would see it, boss them around and ruin people's otherwise perfectly ordinary lives, and largely to sort of misdirect discontent, not against, for example, the fossil fuel companies that destroying the planet, a great expense to people's energy bills and much else, but annoying liberal celebrities, climate protesters, other sort of soft targets that can be blitzed and have everyone follow the rabbit in the wrong direction. So in the UK, we have a channel called GB News that was set up. Despite its name, it's actually owned by an investment firm based in Dubai, and it pushes out these kind of narratives. There's also, as I mentioned earlier, Talk TV, which is owned by News UK, and it's part of the same sort of family of media outlets that includes Fox News. And I've recently been reported of just the extent to which they are constantly pumping out climate disinformation along these sort of lines: pro-fossil fuels, anti-renewables, and attacks on climate action as sort of simultaneously the work of dangerous fringe radicals, but also out of touch aristocrats. And what you see here is there's a spectrum. So there's a way that these ideas are sort of mainstreamed. So I think that what you heard in the previous presentation was conspiracy theories that are at the sort of extreme end of it. But actually, if you slide back a bit to these sort of media pundits or politicians that think they need to cater to that sort of sentiment and are being outflanked on the right, you'll get more or less the same arguments, as I say, about the need for fossil fuels, that renewables aren't reliable, and that climate advocates are sort of crazy, they're part of a cult, or they're out of touch and not really understanding people's needs, and what they're doing is very damaging for people. That's how you get what should be something that someone says wearing a sandwich board and ringing a bell, or sending letters in green ink to newspapers, coming out of the mouths of mainstream politicians and influencing actual policy in people's lives. Probably coming to the end of my remarks, I'll just add quickly, in case anyone's wondering what we can do about this. I would say absolutely essential would be good communication about climate policy and why it's necessary. I think as long as people don't understand what's happening in terms of the energy transition and why it's important, then there's going to be these pinch points around switching from ICE vehicles to electric vehicles, changing people's boilers from gas to heat pumps and so on. Every element in which there has to be a change in order to address the climate crisis, there will be opportunities for populist demagogues to scare people, undermine public support for those policies, and possibly ride that to power, where these sorts of political interests can simply drop climate action off the side of the bus. So I think I'll stop there, but I look forward to any questions you might have about anything I've said. And thanks for having me.
Thank you, Alexandra, Jennie, Adam. Well, I hope everybody has enjoyed this very interesting round of contributions. Unfortunately, MEP Alexandra Geese can stay with us for the questions and answers session that I am very glad to open right now. I see that there are already a few on our Slido page. May I remind you that you can participate using the hashtag DisinfoLab on slido.com or by scanning the QR code that you can see on your screen. So the first question, the one with more votes, let me read. I'll leave the floor to either you, Jennie, or Adam, so you can take over this question. So the massive social consumption of content on social networks make it more difficult to combat greenwashing campaigns. Are platforms doing enough against this? And if you don't mind this question, if you allow me, I would like to ask you about the recent investigation by the BBC on climate denialism on TikTok, which perhaps you can take it as a starting point to answer this question. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm happy to field that. So on Friday, and maybe Anna, you can put this into the chat, the BBC released a big investigation because in April of this year, TikTok announced its first explicit policy to try and combat climate misinformation. And the way that they have structured that is under 3 tiers. So within their existing terms of service, they have content which is not eligible, which means that it should be actively removed by the platform. They have content which is for you feed ineligible, which means that it should not be artificially promoted or amplified into people's news feeds. And then it has content which is eligible. And the way that they chose to structure that for climate is outright climate denial was not eligible. Conspiracist discussions that talk about, unsubstantiated claims of global plots and global elites are for you feed ineligible. And broader conversations about climate policy are eligible. Now, there are 2 different points here. The first is, are they capable of enforcing that policy? And the second question is it the right policy in the first place? Now, the BBC research showed unequivocally that the answer to the first question is no. They found 365 videos which were outright, climate change is a hoax, climate change is a scam. And I think those videos had over 30 million views. They reported them to the platform under the Mis and Disinformation tool that exists to users. And after 24 hours, 95% of the videos were still live. Now, since the investigation has launched, the BBC have been in contact with the platform. They have since removed all of those videos and indeed taken some punitive action against the accounts. But I think that is really missing the bigger picture here, which is that content removal is an incredibly blunt instrument and in large ways both unsuccessful and unconstructive. It's unsuccessful because unless you're going to have 1 billion content moderators existing around the globe who speak in every single language and are able to review tens of millions, if not billions of data points in any given day, you're never going to be able to deal with the problem. You're always going to be operating on the back foot because of the sheer amount of content that exists. But also at a much more fundamental level, I do think it takes you into a problematic space around freedom of speech, which is that, do we want private companies to centralize power on dictating conversations, particularly at a moment where people are very worried about censorship and, feel like their freedoms are being infringed upon? Instead, what we should be focusing on here is freedom of reach and some of the systemic issues that exist in the architecture of platforms, which they don't want to face because it will challenge their ultimate business model. So, what we would say to them is, rather than having this entirely unenforceable content removal, why don't you instead look at the way that your algorithm is creating an incentive for mis and disinformation, for hate speech, for extremist content to thrive and rise to the surface, while good information never seems to gain quite as much traction. But that kind of much more complex and long-term safety by design approach is far less appealing to these companies because it's going to threaten their bottom line. So, short answer is no, they're not doing enough. And when it comes to greenwashing and kind of big companies being able to advertise, they're certainly not doing enough, because most of their revenue is generated through large-scale advertisers, and ultimately the price tag associated with greenwashing campaigns is still in the billions of dollars every year. So they don't want to turn away from that.
Adam, do you have any insights on this? We cannot hear.
No, I don't think I can improve on that. No.
All right, so we're gonna go to the next question. The current context generated by inflation and the energy crisis also contributes to this to this trend. It's ecological discourse being effective. What do you think, guys?
Being effective in what sense? I don't know whether they're able to clarify that question slightly. I mean, I certainly think that at the moment, the kind of populist identity politics narratives are winning in the battle to gain prominence within the information space, because they kind of short circuit the need for any data, for any even logic or internal coherence, right? You can use these headlines, kind of neat catchphrases, you can use visuals, and you never really need to engage with the substance of the issue. Whereas the problem for science communicators is that they're always having to work from a position of trying to communicate nuance and incredibly technical scientific conversations in a way that is intelligible. So, you're operating from a mismatched playing field from the start. But maybe, Adam, you'd be able to comment a little bit more around, for example, in UK politics, how some of these conversations around inflation and the energy crisis are being used by politicians to prevent climate action.
Sure. I mean, just to take a UK example, and it's interesting because it leads back to the prehistory of all this. Classical climate denial organizations like the Global Warming Policy Foundation work with backbench MPs in something called the Net Zero Scrutiny Group to push, in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, for more fossil fuels domestically, as I was saying before, and increasingly undermining renewable energy as an alternative. I think, broadly speaking, the threat from this has two elements. One is that political parties feel the heat from the right flank, which, as Jennie correctly says, appeals to emotion and uses simple messaging. And that can bump politicians into thinking, well, if this isn't popular, if it's going to unseat us from power, why are we going along with it? I don't mean to suggest that politicians aren't led by their consciences and a desire to do good, but you never know. So, and with the public, I think it will cut through again, because if people aren't given accurate and understandable information, they will go for what they are hearing constantly and what seems to make sense to them. So again, I think, but that doesn't mean you can't short circuit that. I mean, for example, the arguments are nonsense, and I think once people hear what's wrong with them once, they're sort of inoculated to hearing it again. The people can't go around saying, "Oh, the global gas markets are very volatile. That's why we need to have more gas domestically, even though it'll be sold on global market prices and will be controlled by the companies that make it." You see what I mean? Once someone hears that once, then the next time someone says, "If only we had our own gas here," they would understand that that is a trick, and hopefully we'll fall for it.
I think also to build on that, the success of these narratives is that they exploit the middle ground between members of the public who do genuinely believe in the issue of climate change and potentially want government-led action in order to solve it, but who are very confused about what the viable pathways going forward are. And it's when people are suffering genuine deprivation and feeling in a position of enormous personal precarity and trauma about their ability to pay their bills, or, you know, what the future is going to look like for their children, that it is very easy to make the argument, now is not the right time. So, you know, yes, of course, we believe in climate change. You know, we're not conspiracy theorists, but look what's happening with the cost of living crisis. You know, now isn't the time to pivot our energy infrastructure to renewables. It's too expensive. It's going to make your lives worse. Like, let's kick the can down the road. And it would be wrong, I think, to say that everybody who is receptive to these ideas is inherently a conspiracist or an extremist. People are experiencing real seismic issues in their lives and genuine pain. And a lot of people also came out of the pandemic with very serious personal trauma, where they saw their personal and their professional lives change overnight. And the problem is that it's extremely easy to weaponize all of those emotions and all of those concerns and grievances and pivot them towards completely unsubstantiated claims.
Thank you both. I myself cannot miss the opportunity to pose a question. So how do we counter such false narratives, especially when they come from allegedly expert scientists or academics? For example, in our latest investigation about climate change disinformation in Belgium, we've seen a number of university professors who openly call themselves climate change skeptics, sharing wrong and misleading points of view. So it seems that because their statements, they're coming from the university field, their opinions are more valid, more credible. So when this kind of actors launches these kind of narratives, we wonder first how we can battle them. And we also wonder what's happening. This is part of a broader disinformation strategy. They have genuine personal convictions, or their personal monetary goals, reputational goals. Please illustrate us.
I mean, on that second question, it's incredibly difficult to tell, you know, and that's why we usually use the phrase both mis and disinformation, because it's so difficult often to determine whether there is an explicit motive to deceive. For some people, I do think there is an ideological drive. They have either willfully convinced themselves that climate change isn't a problem, or that we're being overly hysterical. I think for a much broader group of the actors in this space, there is very clearly an incentive, and it's a profit-making incentive, either because they're affiliated to the fossil fuel industry, or, as I said, because they're part of the outrage economy. So their job, their way of generating revenue for themselves is to be incendiary. It's to be counter to the mainstream. And it doesn't matter whether they're talking about climate or anything else. You know, there is a group that call themselves the intellectual dark web online, and their entire sort of reason for being is basically the grift of spreading this kind of content. On your first question of how we deal with it, it is incredibly difficult, not just for the reason that I mentioned earlier around, you know, one side doesn't need to have any facts and the other side has all the facts, but they're difficult to communicate, or not as sexy as the, you know, controversial identity politics style arguments. There are a few things that I think would help. The first, and DeSmog are one of the actors that are really on the front lines of doing this, is to continually expose the affiliations and the relationships that some of these experts have with the fossil fuel industry, because a lot of that is hidden from the public. And sometimes those are financial links, sometimes they're political links, or, you know, slightly more informal, but there is a lot of open source and investigative and intelligence work happening to try and make that more present in the public domain, so that then it's harder for these people to be platformed and be seen as credible gatekeepers. So that's one thing. The second is we really need to be flooding the zone a lot more with the repetitive arguments that the other side are using, but based in fact. So, you know, yes, you're always going to be able to find the 1% of global scientists who don't support, you know, the consensus positions, or who sign things like the World Climate Declaration, which is absolutely viral across Twitter and used as an example of the fact that there is not agreement within the community. But what we have to do in reverse is constantly flood the zone with the data around how many scientists support the same basic facts here. And I think often we fall into a trap of feeling like we need to make a different argument every time, or, you know, we need to find a new way of saying it, because we sort of get bored of hearing ourselves make the same points over and over. But the reality is that to compete in this particular information environment, both on social media and in traditional media, you do have to go for repetition. You have to keep emphasizing 99% of climate scientists are supportive of the consensus position. The IPCC is unequivocal. All member states around the globe have signed on to the IPCC reports. This is not a global north versus global south thing. This is not a rich versus poor thing. This is not a, you know, white people versus ethnic minorities thing. And that there is value in continuing to make those points. And then I think the third piece of advice that I would give is always trying to contextualize this issue for local communities. So, you know, one of the big problems we have around climate is that it is this huge, overwhelming, generational, transnational challenge that can often feel completely all-consuming for people and impossible to navigate. And what they're unable to see is both the impacts for them personally, but also the potential benefits of the net zero transition for them personally. And there has been a real failure in local or hyper-local communication in saying, look, these are the impacts that you're already feeling. Air pollution is worse in this area. Your children are going to be suffering, you know, more likely to develop asthma. You can't get around as easily, etc., etc. And here are the trade-offs and potential dividends of various different solutions going forward, and actually have a kind of candid, open discussion with citizens that makes them feel much more centered in the issue and able to relate it to their everyday lives.
Thank you, Jennie. This last question, because I believe we don't have time for more questions, is for you, Adam. How, it's connected to what Jennie has said, but I would like to hear your opinion. How can one deal with climate change denialism on the individual level through friends and family members? Any tips? 1, 2, 3. Please share with us.
On the individual level, well, I personally like browbeating people and shaming them into changing their minds. I've always found that's the most enjoyable for at least one person involved. There's actually a lot of argument that doesn't work, but actually I find that I usually will doubt my own opinions about things when something is argued for forcefully. So I don't think polemic is necessarily something to worry about. There's gazillions of excellent explainers for anyone who's got access to the internet, or shelves and shelves of books in every bookshop and library. I think just stick to the basics. Talk also about how we know what we know, rather than just what the facts are that can be rivaled by someone else asserting facts. If you actually explain how these were arrived at and encourage critical thinking, I think that's probably the best thing. And I would just add, which is a related point in answer to the last question, debate about policy solutions is fantastic. There should be more of that, but it's very difficult to do that when people are polluting the space and recycling the same old talking points that have been discredited for decades. If you really want to have skepticism about climate solutions, then you have to separate out bad faith actors from people who really want to do something.
Thank you, Adam. We have many more questions, well, not many, but there's a DSA question that I would have liked to address, but unfortunately we are running out of time. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending. Thank you, Alexandra, Jennie, Adam, the Heinrich Böll Foundation, and my dear colleague, Leticia, for making this webinar possible. It was lovely to have this time with you, and I hope we keep in touch. May I please ask you to rate this webinar through Slido? Your feedback is always important to us, and I remind you also that this webinar will be available soon to be replayed in our YouTube channel, maybe tomorrow. I also take the occasion to remind all of you our annual conference, Disinfo 2023, to be held on the 11th and 12th of October in Krakow. Don't forget to register. This has been a real pleasure. Thank you again, and I wish you all a great week. Goodbye.